Hi guys, Brittany here again. Just a little introduction about myself. I started studying the Bible in April 2017. And when I started, I knew nothing and it was very overwhelming and a lot to learn and almost kind of stressful. So I wanted to start teaching a very basic overview of the Bible for people just starting out to know. There won't be a lot of explanations, but just a broad overview so that you can know where to start and know where to go. Last week we talked about the parts of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, some of the books and what they were. We talked about the four Gospels, which are the first four books of the New Testament. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they are the books written about the time when Jesus walked the earth. So let's dive into the four different ones. So we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they are called the Synoptic Gospels because they are written very similarly. They have a lot of the same things going on, same timeline. John is a little different. Let's see. Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Matthew was an apostle of Jesus. He was a follower. He was also a tax collector, which back then was one of the lowest of the lows. It was like a politician nowadays where they thought that they would steal money and they were very dishonest and stuff like that. But Jesus asked him to follow him, and he did. And Jesus always got a lot of backlash about associating with people like Matthew, with tax collectors, with prostitutes. And it leads into one of my favorite verses of the Bible. It's from the very beginning, it's been one of my favorite verses. It is not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. I've come not to call the righteous, but to call the sinners. And Matthew's main reason for writing was to prove that Jesus was the Messiah and that he fulfilled prophecies. And it also gives a lot of genealogy on Jesus. It's one of the books that tells Jesus's childhood a little bit. It's also the largest gospel and my favorite. Mark, let me see my notes on Mark here. What's my notes on Mark? Okay. All right. So it's said that Mark is written by John Mark, who was a cousin of Barnabas, who we will talk more about when we get to Paul. And he was friends with the Apostle Peter. It is said to be the oldest gospel. Let's see. John Mark did go on one of the missionary trips with Paul and Barnabas. It leaves out Jesus' childhood, but we'll learn more about John Mark whenever we get to Paul, I believe, in Acts. Luke is my other favorite. I like the two biggest Gospels. It also does a little bit of childhood, which I think that's why I like them so much. The book Luke was written by Luke, who was a doctor. And he was also a friend of Paul, and he was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but he wrote he was friends with those who were, and he wrote through them. This book was written for non-Jewish people. So it's not only trying to convert people to believe in God, then trying to convert people to believe in Jesus. And let's see. He also wrote Acts, which we'll get to later. Acts is one of my favorite books. I really, really gravitate toward the Gospel in Acts. Let's see. I've got like 2 sets of notes going on here. And the last book, the book of John. Like I said, John was set up a little differently. Normally, when people start reading the Bible, most things online and stuff like that tell you to start with the book of John. I think maybe because it's easier to understand. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a good place to start if you're trying to. It's written by John the Apostle, and it was written to show the human side of Jesus. Let's see. This one is seen more reliable than the other 3 Gospels because they found complete text as far back as the 3rd century. So they found this one in more complete form than the other 3, which it doesn't have Jesus' baptism. It doesn't have a lot of the parables or stories that the other 3 have. It doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, which is extremely popular. That's mainly in Matthew, I do believe. And it teaches a little bit more about how people debated about Jesus' death and whether or not to kill him. So that's pretty much it. Next week, I'm going to combine all the Gospels in one, and instead of doing Gospel by book by book, I'm going to start with Jesus' birth and go through a timeline of Jesus and pull little bits and segments from every Gospel. So that should be fun. Have a great night. God bless.